Welcome here to the National Tropical Weather Conference live cast brought to you by USAA, South Padre Island Convention and Tourist Bureau, and Plylock's Hurricane Clips. It is a team effort between me and Tim Smith and, of course, Bill Reed. This morning we have with us Tim Smith. So, Tim, it's all yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Alex, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to NTWC Live. We are glad to have you along on this day when we're going to do a little bit of history. You know, we've been talking a lot about, the hurricane season, how active it is and why, and all of the things that go along with this busy hurricane season. But today we're going to change gears a little bit and take a look back at the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. And it's going to be, I think, a fascinating discussion. So we welcome you all. We once again, as Alex mentioned, want to thank our sponsors, South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau, once again with us, as they have been from the beginning. That's where we do the National Tropical Weather Conference live every year, but this year we're virtual because of COVID. We also thank USAA. They've been with us from the beginning as well. And also Plylock's Hurricane Clips, our newest sponsor. You know about these little guys. You put them on your plywood. The hurricane's threatening, pop it in the windows and keep you safe. We could talk more about that at another time. A lot going on in the tropics today as well, so we're going to get a quick update on that, and then we'll move on to our panel. So let's turn it over to our moderator in Houston, the former director of the National Hurricane Center, Mr. Bill Reed. Good morning, Bill.
Morning, Tim, and everybody. We've got a lot to cover, so I'll just give a quick overview, and hopefully I can get this to work just the way it's supposed to. I don't see anything. You guys see anything yet?
Not yet.
We just see that you're presenting to everyone.
It's funny, it won't go up to the screen. Okay, I'm going to talk our way through. There's a lot going on in the Atlantic. The 10 o'clock advisories had little change with Paulette and Renee. The basic on them, and at least for the foreseeable future, 5 days and even beyond, they're going to be trapped out there in the Atlantic under very sluggish steering currents. And what remains to be seen what their long-term future is. Safe to be said, nothing in the near term affecting the Caribbean or the United States. Another system is due to come off Africa the next couple of days and develop by the end of the week or over the weekend. And that will be another one we have to monitor. Way too soon to predict its outcome. And last, and probably least, is this sheared up looking system southwest of Bermuda that's going to drift into the southeast U.S. and most models do, all the models don't like it enough to develop it at this time. The 1900 storm, near and dear to me. Before I went to the Hurricane Center, I was the meteorologist in charge of the Houston Galveston area weather office, basically a descendant of the Galveston office that rode out and suffered so much in that 1900 storm. And in addition to the storm and its history and all that I get ingrained in the years I worked here, I was very privileged to be here for the 100th anniversary of the great catastrophe and got to meet and listen to a lot of people who know a lot about the storm. So today we decided we would put together a panel. I guess I'll introduce them all now and then we'll get going on the string there. First up will be Dr. Chris Lanzi, who's been at the Hurricane Center since 2005 and is currently the chief of the Tropical Analysis and Forecast Branch. Prior to NHC, Chris was a research meteorologist at NOAA's Hurricane Research Division, where, among other activities, he got to fly into such lovely storms as Gilbert and Katrina in the P3 or G4. Chris has a Bachelor of Science in Meteorology from UCLA and his master's and doctor's degree under the inimitable Bill Gray at Colorado State. Among his wide-ranging expertise in all things tropical, Chris has a long-standing interest in the historical aspects of storms and serves on the reanalysis committee, which works on the data to make sure we have the best possible historical record of those storms. Next on the agenda will be Jody Wright Gidley, a resident here in Galveston County, currently works as gifts officer at College of the Mainland. She's a former director of Santa Fe, Texas Education Foundation and Galveston County Historical Museum. She's a co-author of numerous publications and books, most notably to the event of today, one entitled Galveston, A City on Stilts, published back in 2008. Then we'll have Stan Blasek. Stan is a weather historian and consultant, the author of A Century of Galveston Weather. And not just hurricanes. He talks about our infamous snowstorms that we've had, infamous for Galveston, maybe not for Denver. Stan currently works for Galveston County Daily News as a weather consultant and does the same for Galveston.com. He's taught hurricane history for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute and serves as an associate with Lou Fincher. He has presented twice at the National Hurricane Conference, and he's also presented at our very own National Tropical Weather Conference. And lastly will be Lou Fincher, who has had a long interest in hurricane preparedness during his career with the DuPont Company. He developed industry-related plans for preparing for and writing out hurricanes, eventually leading the team at various DuPont plants along the Gulf and East Coast. After retirement, Lou has continued to speak on the preparedness needs of citizens in our area. He is a noted hurricane historian with special interest in landfalling storms in Texas. He has written a report on the 1943 hurricane and given numerous presentations on historical aspects of storms. Apropos for today, he has studied extensively the 1900 storm. So I'm going to turn it over at this point to Chris Lanzi.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. Let me go ahead and bring up my presentation here. So I'm honored to participate in the National Tropical Weather Conference. It's my first time helping out. And again, I work at the National Hurricane Center. I'm in charge of our marine branch, where we have 18 marine forecasters, and our core governmental partner is the U.S. Coast Guard. So we've been doing, unfortunately, a lot of briefings for both District 7 here in Miami and District 8 in New Orleans the last few weeks. This week's a little quieter for us, thank goodness. So I'm going to talk a bit about the meteorology of the Galveston hurricane in the context of the Atlantic Hurricane Database Reanalysis Project. What is that? And so this is a side project I've been involved with for many years. And in particular, right now I'm working with a few folks, Andrew Hagan, who's here at the Hurricane Center, Sandy Delgado, who is at the Weather Forecast Office in Key West. And we also have a committee that takes a look at this. So go ahead and dive in then. So what is this hurricane database? Well, it turns out HURDAT, or for Hurricane Database, pretty intuitive, is our official record.
I don't know if you're sharing your screen. We're not seeing your screen yet. I don't know if you're sharing it.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Let me share screen then. Okay. All right.
Got it. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you. All right. Okay. So again, to start,
we're still not
right.
seeing it, Chris.
It's good. We got it.
Okay. I don't see it here.
Interesting, because I'm seeing it just fine now.
Okay, we're good.
You got it? Okay. All right. So again, we're going to talk about the 1900 Galveston hurricane in the context of a reassessment or reanalysis project that I've been involved with. So what is this HURDAT? That stands for Hurricane Database, makes sense. And it's our official records. So we have records that go all the way back to 1851 and all the way forward to 2019. And it's a record of all the known tropical cyclones, whether it's depressions, tropical storms, subtropical storms, and hurricanes. And it goes back to every 6 hours. Positions to the nearest 1/10 degree latitude, longitude. So that's the nearest 6 miles. Intensity. Intensity is just, well, what are the strongest winds? And we record them in this database as the peak 1 minute wind to the nearest 5 knots. That's a little bit stronger than 5 miles per hour. We have central pressure. In the last 15 or so years, we indicate the size of the storm too. So that's separate from how strong are the peak winds, but how big is it? Is it a real big storm like Laura, or is it a real tiny system? And so you might imagine this database is a lot different now than it was in 1851 or the time of the Hurricane Galveston storm in 1900. Certainly, we have a lot more technology that helps inform what we're doing today. So why is this database important? Well, it turns out this single database is used not just by meteorologists, but a huge number of different groups rely upon it for decision making. So here at the Hurricane Center, we use it to verify our official forecasts as well as the models that we get for track and intensity. So that's important. We also use it for our climatology friends to look at long-term trends, seasonal forecast verification, et cetera. And so if one is trying to look at, well, how have hurricanes changed over time, this is the database to take a look at that. It's also used by the folks that set building codes, and as well as the insurance industry. What, for example, what insurance rate should somebody charge at the coast and inland from the hurricane threat? And also what kind of building codes would it be appropriate? And that depends on how often you get strong hurricanes. And finally, it's used by emergency managers to get an idea, well, how often do we get hurricanes here? And what's the strongest that we've ever seen? And so that can help them prepare for the impacts of hurricanes in the future. So this database is critical, and yet it is full of errors. There's lots of problems with it. So that's why we try to revise it. We're trying to make it more complete and remove some of the biases in there. So for example, one error that was real prominent a couple years ago, the great 1938 New England hurricane was listed as a Category 3 at landfall, but it only had 100-mile-per-hour winds. That doesn't jive, because Category 3 winds are 115 miles per hour or greater. There's also issues of missing storms. Storms in the early part of the era, before satellites were available, that no ships went through, or at least no ships that they knew about at the time. And so can we discover some of these missing storms and add them in? And it turns out with more digitization of ship records, we're finding storms that ships went through, but they didn't recognize at the time. There's also issues about, well, when a storm makes landfall, where did it exactly hit and what time? And that kind of information actually was not in the original database. And then finally, our understanding of hurricanes changes over time. So that picture on the right is a dropson. And we started launching those into the eye wall where the strongest winds of hurricanes are, starting about the year 1997. And within a few years, we realized there were stronger winds at the ocean surface than what we'd acknowledged before. So we actually take that information and go backwards in time to try to take the reconnaissance data and fix it up. So there's a lot of errors, both kind of random and systematic, that we're trying to address as we reassess this hurricanes to make a more complete database. So meteorologists, the insurance industry, the engineering side, all has a better database to start with. So the data sources, when we were going through the reanalysis that we're working on right now, we're focused on the 1960s and 1970s. And so there's actual hand-drawn maps from by the original hurricane forecasters. There's a reassessment that the U.S. Navy did with the Weather Bureau in the 1970s. There's a wonderful database of ships records from the National Center for Environmental Intelligence, which is in Asheville, North Carolina. Goes all the way back to the 1500s. It's the biggest database of ship records in the world on the meteorology. The reconnaissance flights, as well as research flights by the hurricane hunters, early satellite pictures, radar imagery. Starting in the 1950s, radars were equipped along the U.S. coast to help monitor hurricanes primarily. Station observations, and then models themselves. There's been efforts to go backwards in time and run computer models to look at hurricanes. So what was available in 1900? Well, most of this weren't. So all we had were some of the historical weather maps, the ships, and again, that's adding in some information and stations. So no radar, obviously, no satellite, no reconnaissance. We can't go back in time with a hurricane hunter to 1900, though that would have been pretty cool to be able to do. So we have limited tools in trying to figure out what happened back then. So how do we do this? Well, we assemble all the observations into a database, and then we do an assessment 4 times a day. And we say, well, knowing everything that's available now, where was the storm center and how strong was it? And so we redetermine the track and intensity. And the most important thing is we document everything. So any changes we make and are approved by a committee here at the Hurricane Center has to be well written up so that someone 30 years from now that do another reassessment of the database can see, well, what were the observations and why did we change them? Because we want to make it very clear cut about the revisions we're making and why. So how do you change the position of the storm? Well, it turns out that's the easiest part because hurricanes are symmetric. The winds spin counterclockwise around, and it's not a perfect circle. It's actually a spiral inward. So it's about a degree of 20 degrees from a perfect spiral. So the winds are pointed inward slightly. So even if you have 2 measurements, say a ship here south of a hurricane and a ship northwest of a hurricane, you just can interpolate to get where the center is. And that works really well, especially in the tropics and the Gulf of Mexico. Not as much in the higher latitudes when storms become a little more asymmetric, a little lopsided. And so if we have even 2 pieces of data, we can check the track that we come up with and make a change. It's important to note, we don't make revisions to the database unless there is reason for doing it. And so, so we try not to make changes unless it's warranted. So for intensity or the peak winds, it's a little more problematic. Most of the time, ships, even in 1900, were trying their best to stay away from hurricanes. They had barometers on board, and when their barometers started dropping, the pressure going down, they knew that was bad weather. And when you are facing the wind, storm's off to your right. So you want to try to avoid that with a ship. And so they would get out of the way. Good for the ship, bad for meteorologists because we didn't have as much information. It's also important to note in 1900, ships, even though they were using the Beaufort scale to estimate the winds over the water, they didn't have any 2-way radios. And so there was no way that a ship, say over the Gulf of Mexico, could call back to, say, the Galveston office and talk to Isaac Monroe Klein and let him know what was going on. That first happened in 1909. So they also had anemometers to measure the winds at weather stations. Some of these had pretty big biases that they actually overestimated the winds because they didn't even have a good way to calibrate a 100-mile-per-hour wind because nothing moved 100 miles per hour back in 1900. And then finally, we used some additional meteorological techniques to try to tease out as best we can the intensity. Obviously, the best ways we can address it are right at landfall when we have more information. It's more difficult over the open ocean. All right, so let's talk about the 1900 hurricane in particular. So this was the original track map that was put together after the hurricane season. And Isaac Monroe Klein and company suggested that the Galveston hurricane began halfway between Africa and the Caribbean Sea. So it's the one listed as number 1. It's a tropical storm across the Lesser Antilles and then Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and Cuba. After it left Cuba, what was in the database was it immediately became a hurricane, went over the dry Tortugas of Florida Keys, and then made a westward jog, and finally made a landfall as a hurricane just west of Galveston and Houston, and then stayed a tropical storm all the way to Iowa before becoming a fairly strong extratropical or winter storm as it went across Canada and back over the Atlantic. So that's what's in the original database. What changes did we make that were noteworthy? Well, the first of which, and again, it's the Galveston hurricane is this number 1, so showing tropical storm in yellow, and then hurricane in red, and then red with that railroad track on it showing major hurricane, and then the opposite after landfall. So the first major change was we shifted all the positions pretty far to the east-southeast, at least about 60 miles or more on the 27th, 28th, 29th. And that was based on additional ships that Isaac Monroe Klein did not have. The next thing was we additionally shifted it farther east-southeast on the 4th and 5th of September based on measurements that were taken in Cuba, because Cuba had a fairly sophisticated, for the time, weather network, as developed or more than what was in the United States in 1900. And so the Cuban meteorologists had a real good understanding of what was going on. And they thought after the Galveston storm left Cuba that it got in the Gulf of Mexico. The U.S. meteorologists, on the other hand, thought that the storm had recurved over the Atlantic. That's how sparse our weather network was. And again, it was before ships over the open ocean could send a two-way radio message. And the third major change was we actually made it substantially weaker on the 5th, 6th, and 7th, and delayed the intensification of it to a hurricane by about 12 hours. So instead of it being a hurricane over Dry Tortugas, where we actually had measurements, we delayed that by about 12 hours. And then finally, right near and after landfall, we made it quite a bit stronger. And so I'll show a little bit more of the details of that. So we made it a stronger hurricane over the Gulf of Mexico and inland. And you can see with the current that we've got a hurricane all the way to central Texas and a tropical storm all the way into Kansas before becoming a depression. So that's a long ways inland for those high winds to occur. Somewhat similar to Laura that happened just a few weeks ago, where we had tropical storm winds all the way into Arkansas from that. And then finally, we made some changes after it became an extratropical or winter storm based on ship and measurements in Canada and the northern United States. So those are some of the big changes. To focus right at landfall, I did want to read a little excerpt of how did we come to what the intensity was at landfall. And so this is pretty important because we made a lot of changes to what was in the database. So there was a measurement of 964 millibars at Galveston at Isaac Monroe Klein's weather station. And that was actually put in the database as a central pressure, a reading in the eye. Thing was, it wasn't in the eye. It was a peripheral pressure. It was in the eye wall. And so an earlier researcher, Francis Ho, had come up with a 936 millibar central pressure. So the pressure is always lowest in the eye, and suggested a radius of maximum wind fairly small of about 15 miles. So here at the Hurricane Center, they ended up with a slightly lower pressure for the center part of 931, based on an earlier estimate by Connor in the 1950s. So we sided with the 936 estimate based on our analysis. So that was our best guess of what was the pressure in the eye as it made landfall in Texas. So that we can take that 936 pressure and convert it to wind. We have a thing called a pressure-wind relationship, where we take the pressure and make it a wind. And that gave us winds of about 138 miles per hour. And we rounded that to the nearest 5 because this is not an exact science. And that makes it category 4. So that is consistent with what it was assessed previously, though we did boost the winds from 130 to 140 miles per hour at landfall. So lastly, it's important to recognize the impacts that this system had. This killed anywhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people. The best estimate is 8,000. And obviously, there are a lot of people that don't know what happened to. And it was the single deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. This is it, with the number of people. And almost all of them died in and around Galveston itself, with the city being almost completely destroyed. The damage that occurred back in 1900 was a staggering $34 million. When you adjust for inflation and population change, there's so many more people, not just in Galveston, but in Houston as well as wealth changes per capita. That storm today would be 130 to 140 billion with a B. So it would be one of the worst if same storm were to hit today. And this picture, if you're not sure, is the memorial to the victims from that hurricane that is on the seawall at Galveston today. So I'm going to wrap up just by talking a little bit about the reanalysis. We're trying to go all the way back from 1851 to around the year 2000. And we've already officially changed 115 years worth, plus Hurricane Camille, plus Hurricane Andrew. We've preliminary reanalyzed another half dozen years, and my team and I are still working on the rest of the 20th century. This project really needs to be done globally. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm not sure, Alex and Tim, if you wanted to do questions now or wait to the end if there's time.
We'll get them at the end, Chris. We'll get all the speakers, and then we'll go to the question and answer.
All right.
And I've got questions, so be ready.
Okay, I'm not going anywhere. Let me go ahead and I'll stop presenting then.
Okay, and then you do the mute, and I will now turn it over to Jody.
Okay, I'm gonna turn on my presentation. Can you all see it?
No, not yet.
Can you all see it now?
It's coming up.
There we go.
Okay, so I'm going to try to pick up right where Chris left off. So Galveston before the storm, big city, many firsts in Texas, first newspaper, first medical school, you name it, a whole lot of things in Texas history can be traced back to their start in Galveston. Now, hurricanes had always been a part of Galveston's story. There had been many discussions on what to do about that, how to build a breakwater, and who would pay for it. You know, things were done to try to keep the dunes and planted salt cedars along the beaches to try to help that situation. But really nothing major had been built by the 1900 storm. So on the morning, you know, after the storm, about 8,000 people estimated died, as Chris had said. It remains the worst natural disaster. And then people started paying a little bit more attention on how they could build a breakwater to help future storm damage. So after the storm, this image is a map, and that black line shows the line of complete destruction from the black line to the beach. Back here, this was the debris line. So after the storm, a group of business leaders appealed to the state, and they changed the city charter. And that was a big step in order to be able to move forward on the construction of a seawall and the other projects that came after. So one of the first things the new city charter did under a commission form of government was get a group of engineers together to discuss the possibility of building a seawall. The engineers proposed a 3-mile seawall, and then later on it was extended. But the original 3-mile seawall is the black line that you see on this map. The price tag was $3.5 million. And it was widely accepted that, you know, yeah, we need to do this, but then who was going to pay for it? City commissioners negotiated a deal to default on some bonds from 1882 that cut interest rates in half, and they were able to sell more bonds to pay for this project. The county agreed to construct the seawall while the city was paying for the grade raising, and those projects worked hand in hand together. So in 1902 was when the seawall construction began, and it was a massive engineering feat. The first step was to build a seawall at 17 foot tall. It would be 1.3 feet higher than the water had reached in the 1900 storm, and the concave face would help deflect water as it came on the island. The wall was built on 40 to 44 foot wooden piles which were anchored into the hard clay below. It was longleaf yellow pine from East Texas that built the pilings. This is a cement mixer that was forming the base of the wall. Steel reinforced rods connected the seawall's base to the visible structure that we can see. And there was also a 27-foot granite riprap in front of the wall to help with erosion of the sand. This is a mold of the seawall section. The wall was built in alternating 60-foot sections. So now you see here one of the molds being constructed. There's a blank area, a mold, a blank area, and that's how they constructed it. It took 7 days for the concrete to dry in the molds before they could move on. They built about 7 at a time. Another look at the sections. It was very trendy to visit the construction site to see what was going on. There are even youngsters that would have a ladder and charge people to climb up on top to take a look. These images show the original seawall's curve up 6th Street. The original portion looked like this, and then later on it was extended to cover Fort Crockett and other areas. The initial portion was about 17,590 feet long, about 3.5 miles. It took, it was an amazing feat to bring in 1,800 cars of sand, 1,000 cars of cement, 1,200 cars of round wooden pilings, and the list goes on. So after the seawall, it was time for the grade raising because it wouldn't protect the city very well if behind the wall was just a lower level, like a bowl waiting to be filled with water later. So the grade raising came next. So before the grade raising happened, the highest part of the island was on Broadway. It was about 8 feet above sea level, and the plan was to bring all of the land behind the seawall to 17 feet and then gently slope back into the bay. A New York firm, Gethard and Bates, won the bid to build a canal through town, and the sand as they built the canal through town would be used to fill in behind the seawall, and dredge boats would remove sand from the bay, which was really good for the economy here as well because it would deepen the ship channel and allow for larger ships to come in. And as that stuff was dredged, it was pumped out onto the island, and I'll show you a few more pictures of that in a minute. So the canal is the blue line on here, and that's where the dredge boats would come in and out as they dredged in the bay and come in and out the canal to fill behind the seawall. If you're familiar with Galveston, this image just shows a few landmarks. So this is Broadway, where you see the statue. The bay is back here. This is where the port was. This is where UTMB is today. So this is one of the dredge boats. So its job was to dredge sand from the bottom of the canal and of the bay and bring it in to be dumped behind the seawall. As rent, the grade raising board paid landowners property taxes for the duration of the canals. And there was a lot of haggling involved to get all the property owners on board. So these are more dredge boats. There were 4. Watching this construction project was also very much a trendy thing to do for locals and tourists to come and see. A lot of the canals were also used as swimming holes for kids. It was a great place for them to play. It was dangerous, wasn't a great idea, and there were many accidents. There were drawbridges and pontoon bridges all throughout the city to keep the city functioning throughout the entire project. Landowners were responsible for raising their own houses, and they all were told what the level would be, because depending on where you were in the city, your level would be different. And so it was your responsibility to raise. If you couldn't afford to do it, they would simply just build a little berm around your property and keep going. And eventually you'd have to take care of that problem. This is an ad for one of the construction companies that would help raise houses. So this man is pointing to a level marker. That's where the new level will be. And he's got his property raised and he's waiting for the fill to be pumped in. And this is afterwards. The marker is now at the bottom. And this is what it looked like after all of that sand and mud was pumped in and dried. So the largest building that had to be raised was St. Patrick's Church at 3,000 tons. Took 35 days to do it. They still held church services during the time. This is fill gushing out. So the dredge boats have brought in the sand, pumped it out, and this is what it would look like. It would pour it out with a lot of violence. And really, if you didn't have your structures secured, it would topple things over. Sidewalks never could be really safe. They would fall all the time and have to be rebuilt. Everything had to be raised from outhouses to streetcars to sidewalks to fences. This is a woman waiting to catch the train. Everything raised. Crisscrossed makeshift sidewalks were rebuilt and moved around all the time. The grade raising was done in 4-block sections where earthen barriers were placed around them in an effort to keep the watery fill in, and that's what you're seeing here. Some people tried to protect their greenery, but really nothing survived after all of this. These are some boys standing on the pipes. They were 42 inches. It's pretty easy to get caught off guard with the water coming in. It may be in one place in the morning, but when you tried to return home, it would be in a different place, and it was a mess. There was little chance of trees to make it, so what you're seeing here is a before and after picture before the grade raising was complete, and afterwards all of the trees are dead. There's a lot of effort after the grade raising to fix that problem. So this is the Women's Health Protective Association, a group of Galveston women had formed that after the grade raising to try to help beautify the city. And they had a lot of projects. That was a really major group in Galveston. So after the first seawall section was completed in 1904, the beach area underwent a boom of construction and to entice tourists to the beach. So there were bathhouses. These pictures don't have a lot to do with the grade raising story, but they're some of my favorites, so I didn't want to leave them out. Water park. This is the Galvez, which is still there today. So now we're just taking a quick little tour to the port, because after the grade raising and the seawall was built, there was a lot of investment in business in Galveston because it was considered to now be very safe. And so we have, the port is growing with larger ships. Galveston became an immigration center. These are immigrants arriving in Galveston where they were processed. They were in warehouses to be processed. And the Strand was an area that actually was not raised during the grade raising. It was just too complicated to raise those buildings that were, that had survived the storm. They of course flooded, and then today that is exactly why you still see flooding going on downtown, because these buildings were not raised in the grade raising. Broadway area here is the last part of the grade raising, so that's what you're seeing there is the very last section. So after the grade raising and the seawall was built, the causeway was built. And all of those projects were seen as something that would save the island. But there were also storms that came after. So what you're seeing here is the hurricanes that struck again in 1909 and 1915. And the sand that had been used in the grade raising was not very stable. The entrance to the causeway was not quite stabilized. And so hurricanes continue to be a part of Galveston's story that, is dealt with throughout the years. All of these pictures that you've seen, most of them are from Galveston, a City on Stilts. That was co-authored by myself and Jennifer Marinas. I want to put a shout out to her. Couldn't have happened without her work. All of the photos are from a collection of photos from a photographer named Ed Worthy, and he is in this photo right here. And so I just like to show that the woman that donated these photos to the museum was very proud to be able to share this collection with Galveston's history. And that concludes.
Well, thank you, Jody. It's a fascinating story and covering it very thoroughly in a short period of time. I gave the introductions a little out of order, but I'll get you back on track now. Our next speaker will be Lou Fincher. Lou, take it away.
Whoa, hang on a second. Oh boy. Okay, sorry about that. Can you hear me at all?
We got you.
Can you see me? 'Cause I can't even see myself.
We got you.
We see
Okay.
you.
All righty, let me, where do you do that? Is it present now? Is that
That's
the
it.
one? Entire screen, okay. See if it comes up. Okay. Well, are you seeing my screen at all?
Nope.
Says it's showing sharing my screen, but you're not seeing it.
Not yet. No.
Now it's working.
Okay. Okay, I'm presenting to everyone, but I don't see what I'm doing. Are you actually seeing my screen? Because it says you're presenting to everyone. It says top.
Click on your
presented.
slideshow. Click on your slideshow, Lou,
Okay.
and then start it.
Can you see that?
Yeah. Run the program, run the slideshow.
Okay.
There you
Okay.
go.
Can you see that? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Sorry about my problems this morning. I had a major blip on my computer system, and then I had trouble even getting back in here. As we all know, it's the 120th remembrance of the 1900 storm, the worst disaster in United States history, natural disaster. I'm Lou Fincher. I'm with the Galveston County Historical Commission that I also am with Stan Blasik and Jody. We're all three members of the commission, been members for quite a long time. Remember the 1900 storm. Now, some of this I've gathered from different places, and Chris has got the latest stuff, and so I would go with if there's a mistake here, it's probably on mine, not Chris's. Okay. But you think about that, Galveston is an island, I used to sail on the Alyssa, the tall ship Alyssa. And we used to go out in the Gulf. And if we're out in the Gulf and we're coming back towards Galveston, it looks just like some buildings coming out of the Gulf. It's really strange looking from just a few miles offshore. I think every time I'm out there and I see that, I think about the 1900 storm and what's going on. 1 second, please. Time it. 1 second. Okay. Sorry. Anyway, I look at that and then I think back about the 1900 storm and what happened and how those people must have felt as the water came from the Bay Area and then the water came from the storm surge from the Gulf. We were both actually probably had storm surges on both sides. But Galveston had been used to these overflows. They called them overflows. So nobody was in a panic when they first started seeing the high water running through the streets. But what really got everybody's attention was the pounding waves rolling ashore and not retreating. They said that you could actually pick up the thunder, the rumble, the shaking of those waves, on seismograph. Sorry about that. That's how pounding they were. This wasn't unusual. As you remember Hurricane Ike, where was everybody out? On the seawall, watching these huge boulders shoot up about 60 feet in the air and go all the way across Seawall Boulevard. Facts about the storm. People were told to go to the highest elevation, go in towards the city. That was only about 8.5, 8.7 feet of elevation. The height of the storm surge was about 15.7 feet. How long can you tread water? Think about that. It doesn't, you're going to have to go to high ground. And you think about water, these waves coming through and pounding on these buildings. A cubic yard of salt water weighs about 1,728 pounds. It's almost like a ton. And you can imagine those waves hitting. And you think about, what in the world could they do? They couldn't do anything. Nothing. Buildings were built to withstand wind loads, not water loads. And this is what the combination did to the island of Galveston, and not just on Galveston. The population was about 38,000 people, and between 6 and 8 probably died on the island, and then a few more thousand died inland. All around Galveston County, the coastal communities, all the way from West Texas to East Texas, they all got impacted. It's a big storm. The number of buildings on Galveston alone, 3,600 buildings. And the meteorologist in charge, that was Isaac Klein, he guessed it at 125 back then. But he was guessing because the anemometer had blown away. The damages back then was about 20 million. Today, well, in 2000, it was about 700 million. Today, if something like this happened, you put in the ship channel and all the industries, that is a major nightmare. I want to read this to you. There's an old song, and it was written about the storm. Wasn't that a mighty storm? The picture in the background is Galveston in 1894, flat. You see parts of the city in the background, but this was flat. So take in mind when you read these lines. Wasn't that a mighty storm? Wasn't that a mighty storm with water? Wasn't that a mighty storm that blew the people all away? Now, death in 1900, that was many years ago on September 8th. The sea, it began growing. The ship could not stand. I heard the captain crying. Wasn't that a mighty storm? Wasn't that a mighty storm with water? Wasn't that a mighty storm that blew the people all away? It devastated every town and city in Galveston County. They couldn't even identify the bodies. At first, they were trying to bury the bodies as they found them. But the water was so saturated that as soon as they put a shovel to it, it filled up with water. So what they did, they loaded these bodies up on a barge, and they had to do that at gunpoint and bayonet point. It was sickening. It was driving people crazy. Can you imagine you're taking your son or your daughter, your wife, your mother, and having to put them on a barge to be taken out to sea? But they were trying to do something so disease wouldn't spread. The problem was they took them out, and I think one time the bodies came back before the boats came back to the beach. So they realized that wasn't working, and the bodies were, starting to come apart, actually. Sickening. So they had to pick them up and pile them up where they found them and add lumber. They had to be very careful because there was no water. But they had to set these afire. They had fires for months. They found bodies for, I think, up to 2 years after the storm. But Galveston was not the only city that suffered. Actually, I feel that it probably came in somewhere around the Freeport area we have today, just over past San Luis Pass. Put us in the forward right quadrant. But the worst of the storm, I think, was right in there. But then Galveston got it. It went through Texas, went up through Dallas, went to Oklahoma, Kansas, Iowa, and then to Canada, where the high winds. Think about it, back when Hurricane Ike, back in 2008, after it hit here, it also hit my family that lived in Ohio and in Kentucky. And all they got was a windstorm. They couldn't figure it out. All these high winds came, and a lot of people lost their roofs, including some of my wife's family. It also hit Chicago, Milwaukee, Buffalo, New York, Paris, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Montreal, and Halifax over in Nova Scotia. Even affected the Bay of Fundy. Again, this is Galveston Beach, 6 years before. Think how flat that is. You see no dunes. A lot of people that are not from around here, they're thinking, well, back in 1900, it was, what kind of buildings would they have to withstand a hurricane? They had buildings. They had some wonderful buildings, and they're still standing today. So you look at that architecture that we see around Broadway that survived the storm. It's amazing. People go, wow, y'all really did have some buildings. You had some great architecture. Yes, we did. But you know what? The places on Broadway, a lot of those homes that made it survive weren't just because they were built better. but because that storm surge collapsed so many buildings and structures out towards the beach and coming towards Broadway, which is the main highway there in Galveston, runs the length of the, up towards 45. But it made a dam over 2 stories high of wreckage, debris, and it gradually, just the weight of that stopped the surge from reaching Broadway. So that's why you see a lot of those structures still there. And they're still there today. This is one of the first buildings to go. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It escapes me right now, but this is one of the big bathhouses that Galveston was famous for. The pagoda, that's what it was, the pagoda. And people would come out here, and then there were underneath here, you can see towards the beach, there would be different places they could roll out and change their clothes in and go to the beach, have fun. Fate of Galveston, September 10th. Houston Post. He escaped to tell the hurricane's effects. They really don't have a concept how bad it is. 1,000 persons drowned, killed, or missing, it is estimated. List of the dead on the 11th. Full list will never be known. Many bodies flung on the mainland, others floated out to sea. Yeah, they floated out to sea. I don't know if they recovered any because there wasn't a whole lot of boats available to go looking out at sea. But in the 1915 storm, they found people about 15 miles offshore hanging on to debris. I wondered that after Hurricane Ike, how many people were washed out to sea. Did you know, you talk about other disasters, you always hear about the Chicago fire or the San Francisco earthquake or the Johnstown flood. But the casualties, the fatalities in the 1900 storm that occurred, you can add up all those other disasters and it would not match the death toll of the great Galveston storm of 1900. This is a picture after they were repairing the Galveston's Fort Santa Cinta after the 1900 storm. This fort was made out of concrete and it was just torn up. Many soldiers died right here. This is up in Buffalo, New York. Yacht Club up there was tore up on September 12th. I love this picture. This is from the Galveston Historical Foundation. What a great shot. You can see the old structures after the storm. I think this is on Broadway. And then you see it how it is today. You can imagine, this debris, I forgot, I was going to add a shot, a famous one that's up on Broadway. And you see the Bishop's Palace, but the debris was so high. And how did they clean all that wood, all that debris? These people didn't have earth movers. They had shovels. They had hammers. And they had saw blades. And they cleaned that debris up. Those people had some gumption. They did. They had big hearts, and they were not going to let that keep them down. This is my favorite book on the 1900 storm, A Weekend in September. The Rosenberg Library in Galveston, they have the manuscript from John Edward Williams' work on the Weekend in September. This book has everything. It has a love story about a schoolmarm and her fiance that comes looking for her, in which she went through the storm with her mother, and I think about 50 people in her one room at the Lucas Terrace Apartments. It was a 3-story complex. The only thing that lasted was her room. It's one of the old books from 1900. There's a lot of crazy stuff in here, but they have some really good drawings and really good photographs. That's why I like this book. The track, you can see this track here, where it came from, goes around. This is using Chris's group, the reanalysis, to find the best track. You see how it went up here, all the way across the Red River, Oklahoma, went on up to Chicago and Milwaukee, came over Buffalo, came on up through Maine, just amazing. And I think it ended up close to Newfoundland. What else happened? Down in Columbia, Texas, out to our west, the first capital. That's what was left of it after the 1900 storm. Sorry about that. This is back in the 1890s, Galveston. This is the giant beach house near the beach hotel, which burned a couple years before the 1900 storm. Notice all the flatness here. That's the pagoda. This is what it must have looked like during the storm. All the flying debris, waters and waves coming through the city. Imagine, we've seen this before in modern time. Somebody's up on the roof, but these people are out in the ocean, out in the Gulf, on their roof, like Klein did, both Klein brothers, with Isaac's children. And that's the end of my story.
All right, Lou, if I'll get you to stop sharing, I'll be able to turn it over to Stan.
Okay.
All right, Stan, your show.
Sorry.
You're on mute, Stan.
There we go. Okay. Excuse me. Now I'm going to try the grand experiment that everyone has gone through and see if I can get the presentation up on the screen. Well, no. I'm hitting Alt Tab.
Alt first, okay.
Oh, whoops. Okay. Can everyone see that?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. Fix it, Margaret.
Well, I don't know what,
Can you see it now?
Nope.
Nope.
well, it worked before.
You said it worked for Ford?
Well, before when we
Okay.
showed it. Well, I don't know what's wrong. Jeez, well, so much for planning. I don't know. It doesn't show up, huh?
No.
Nope.
No, we're just seeing
Oh,
the.
well, it's lovely.
See, if you open up the screen all the way, you'll see a thing on the bottom that says present now. You see that?
Oh, yeah, we need to hit present now.
There you go.
Oh, well, now I
You
can't
need to
get
get
back
into
to
that
that
screen.
screen.
Open it up all the way.
Here. Well, let's get out of here.
Well, here.
Maximize it.
Okay, we're working on it.
No, you need to get out of there. Just escape. No,
Well,
here.
okay.
Okay. Where's
Present
present?
now, right there. Aha.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Okay.
Your entire screen. Okay. Then you do the other thing.
Okay.
Oh, but you closed them. Oh, and then Taylor. There you
Can you see it now?
No,
go. No. Now,
nope.
you closed it, Stan. You closed out the one you wanted.
For some reason, it's not going to the share. There you go.
Okay.
But I don't know what it's going to show.
Now click on your presentation.
Where's your presentation?
Here, I'll do it.
Don't stop.
There you
Does
go.
it show? Okay. Okay.
Then you, okay.
Okay.
Oh, yay!
So you can see it now?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yay!
I want to finish the presentations with a look at two questions that fascinate me about the 1900 storm. The first question is, by examining the period leading up to 1900, is it possible to determine if the catastrophe could have been or should have been prevented to some degree, or at least mitigated? And the second question is, what can this history teach us today about hurricane preparedness and planning for potential threats? And I don't promise to have the answer to those. Okay, so the first question, could and should have Galvestonians done more to protect their city from the 1900 disaster, thereby avoiding a near repetition of the fate of Indianola? Originally, sand dunes were the primary source of protection from storm tides on Galveston Island. But this always remained a somewhat sporadic, informal, and episodic attempt to create some sort of protective barriers against what, as Jody mentioned earlier, they called overflows. Although major storms in 1818 and 1837 proved that these barriers were inadequate for strong storms, Galvestonians entered the 1867 hurricane season with no additional protection. As early as 1842, Samuel Swartwout claimed that as sure as there's a God, the whole of Galveston will be swept away in 10 years. Of course, he was interested in building a rival town and seaport and was off his prediction by 58 years. But the question of Galveston's vulnerability would not fade away as the 20th century dawned. The first of the three major storms leading up to the 1900 disaster was in the autumn of 1867. A Category 2 hurricane moved parallel to the Texas coast, causing widespread damage from Brownsville to Sabine Pass. We have a description of the 1867 hurricane in Galveston. Here on the island, the waters were driven with such violence that they rose 6 or 7 feet higher than ordinary spring tides, inundating a large portion of the east end of the island and compelling soldiers of the garrison to desert their quarters and seek safety upon the elevated ground near the city hospital. But the wind blew with such frightful velocity that they finally sought refuge in the lower portion of the old custom house. And this is a photograph we have of damage near the wharves. Outsiders, especially in the rival city of Houston, were quick to take advantage of Galveston's distress following the storm. This was a major factor spurring the development of the ship channel to Houston. Galveston residents responded chiefly by denying that the storm was really all that vulnerable to Gulf hurricanes. But 8 years later, a large Category 3 hurricane made landfall on the middle Texas coast, nearly destroying the city of Indianola. Damage was also extensive in Galveston. As the Signal Corps reported, the east end of the city is submerged and small houses in that area washed away. At the city hospital, the waves were breaking against the building. The railroad bridges to the mainland were washed away. The wharfs were submerged and freight much damaged. Tides reached 13.5 foot in the bay and were 8.5 foot higher than normal at the grain elevators near the wharves. And this is an illustration we have of the 1875 storm. Immediately after the storm, there was much support for the building of a levee, dike, or seawall to protect the city. Basically, the local newspaper was saying that if the Dutch could do it, we could do it as well. 2 days later, the newspaper also claimed that the prevailing belief that the greatest danger to the city would come from an overflow from the bay was no longer viable. Instead, the danger of a storm surge from the Gulf was the biggest threat and needed to be addressed. By October 20th, 1875, a public meeting was held and a resolution passed asking the state for special legislation to protect Galveston and other coastal cities. However, by June 1876, it was apparent that support in Austin was lacking, and by August, the bill was defeated. So in the end, the city settled for a sand barrier fortified by 3 rows of salt cedars set 10 feet apart. A tropical storm in 1877 that veered east of Galveston, and a hurricane in 1879 that made landfall just east of Sabine Pass seemed proof to some that the salt cedar barriers were sufficient. So Galveston went into the busy 1886 hurricane season with little real protection from a major Gulf storm. Unfortunately, the storm started early with a mid-June hurricane causing some minor damage in the city as it veered to the east. But by August, a second stronger storm made landfall in the middle Texas coast, effectively putting an end to Galveston's rival port, Indianola, which is located right there near Port O'Connor. The storm which prevailed here during the night of the 19th and the morning of the 20th was even more destructive to life than the noted storms of 1867 and 1875. The water continued to rise until it was 4 to 6 feet above ground level. The high tide in the Gulf led many to expect an overflow and to prepare for it. Few persons slept that night, and when their fears were realized by water reaching yards and then entering houses, the residents set out for places of safety, some in boats, others in hastily constructed rafts. Daylight found water running streams across the island from the Gulf to the bay, carrying with it debris of fences, houses, trees, clothing, furniture, etc. During the storm, more than 160 houses were more or less damaged, some carried away, and a large building used as a skating rink was demolished. Again, the initial reaction to the storm was strong. In the wake of the 1886 hurricane, Galvestonians began again to consider building a seawall to protect the city. Initially, support was strong for the idea, but as time went on, the debate grew fragmented, with competing proposals, differences of opinion on how necessary such protection was, and whether it would be worth the cost to build such a structure. Right after the storm, the focus of the debate was mostly on the cost of building a seawall and whether it should cover the bay side as well. However, by September 16th, some skeptics appeared, one claiming that any seawall would cost more than Galveston's total property value and that raising the grade of the city a few feet and the restoration of salt cedars would suffice. In October, a letter appeared in the newspaper alleging that Galveston would never be destroyed because any surge in the Gulf would be greatest in the bay, which would lessen the surge in Galveston. Despite this, a seawall committee was formed over the following winter with the task of presenting a plan of action. This led to a proposal for a vote of citizens to approve $500,000 for a seawall project. However, by late spring and summer, some of those involved with the committee noted a growing lack of enthusiasm for the project. By summer, criticism was directed at the proposal by one citizen who claimed that the committee report lacked any scientific solution and could not be built at the cost of the proposal to be voted on. Even some on the committee seemed lukewarm at best. Chairman W.L. Moody stated, "As far as a seawall is concerned, I'm in favor of its erection. However, I do not consider that there is the slightest necessity for one. There has never been, nor there can be, the slightest necessity for a wall to protect human life. The danger of Galveston being swept away by storms is so infinitely small, it is scarcely worthy of being discussed at all. Likewise, committee member George Seeley was ambivalent. While we living in Galveston are perfectly certain there's no danger, people in the interior do not share our confidence. I do say that the city will be vastly benefited in more ways by its erection, as the enemies of Galveston have never lost an opportunity to magnify and distort the facts about storms. At any rate, on September 20th, 1887, the election was postponed to November, and with the committee ultimately revoking the November election. Afterwards, this issue seemed to fade completely from public sphere, and Galveston entered the 1900 storm completely unprotected. Notice the photo of Galveston taken before the storm. Although Galveston's chief rival port in Texas was initially destroyed in the hurricane of 1875, devastated again in 1886, and subsequently abandoned, Galvestonians did not think that the same fate could befall them. In the wake of the 1900 storm, denial and delay was no longer an option if Galveston were to survive. Fortunately, this time common sense prevailed, and the city quickly went ahead with construction of a seawall and raising of the city's grade. We have a letter from a 1900 storm survivor that really sums up the issue that I'm talking about here. After each successive storm, a great deal of discussion was had as to the possibility of devising some scheme which could adequately protect the city against the peril of future storms. Some seemed feasible, some absurd. But as the recollection of each recurring storm grew more dim and the intervals between them longer, people lost interest and nothing was ever attempted. However, the seawall proved its value through many storms, including the 1909 hurricane with a 10-foot surge and the 1915 hurricane with its 120-mile-an-hour winds and 12 to 13-foot tidal surge. However, seawall could not prevent overflows from the bay, so we see flooding in Galveston in the 1915 hurricane, with Hurricane Carla in 1961, and with Hurricane Ike in 2008. Hurricane Ike, okay. Despite the damage in Galveston Island, the destruction in the Bolivar Peninsula from Ike was worse. Hurricane Ike also raised concerns about the vulnerability of the petrochemical plants around Galveston Bay. Almost a third of the total U.S. refining capacity is concentrated in that area. We have an inundation map of Hurricane Ike as it passed through the far eastern end of Galveston County. We can see the highest inundation was off to the right. But we also have a simulation with the hurricane making landfall near San Luis Pass. And you can see that entire Bay Area is much more at risk. We also have some worst case scenarios. One showing the potential inundation surge from a hypothetical category 4 landfall near San Luis Pass, which would be down here. And then a worst case scenario showing landfall of a Camille type category 5 near San Luis Pass with a 22.4-foot surge. In response to Hurricane Ike, several proposals have been put forward for protecting the vulnerable Houston-Galveston area from a catastrophic storm surge. However, the proposals remain unacted upon 12 years later. And so I'm going to finish this presentation with a couple of quotes and a little bit of gallows humor. Quotes are, "Those who do not learn from the past are condemned to repeat it." And the other is a Sufi proverb, "A lesson keeps repeating itself until it's learned." What we have here are images from Hurricane New Orleans and Hurricane Betsy in 1965, and then Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Whoops. So we can say that Galveston has proven its resilience over time. But are there lessons we can learn from the past? And then, so I have a little bit of gallows humor here. Okay, the big bad wolf blew our houses down 3 separate times, but there's no reason to believe he will do it a 4th time. So thank you.
Okay, Stan, you stop sharing screen. We'll be ready to go.
Okay, there we are.
My monitors tell me we only got about 7 or 8 minutes to go here, so I'll have maybe a question or so for each of you real quickly here. For Chris, looking at the reanalysis track in the Gulf, do you suspect there was at least one episode of rapid intensification as it was just south or southeast of New Orleans?
So in the modern era, when we look at Category 4 and 5 hurricanes, almost all of them undergo a rapid intensification event. That's where the winds spin up 35 miles per hour in 24 hours, 35 miles per hour or more. And so it's almost assured that the 1900 Galveston hurricane did go through rapid intensification. The only hard piece of data we have over the Gulf of Mexico was a ship that measured 974 millibars. And so we know at that point it was already approaching Category 3. But where exactly it underwent rapid intensification, we don't know for sure.
Okay. And Jody, was there any consideration? I know that you mentioned the cost of raising the areas along the bay was prohibitive. Was there any consideration at that time of adding a levee or a seawall on the backside to prevent that bay water flooding?
I think there's definitely talk about it, but considering the fact that the grade raising and the seawall were going to be such huge projects, that was really all anyone felt like they could move forward with and get done.
Yeah, it's too bad it didn't happen. It would solve a few problems today. Lou, being as immersed in these as you get, when Hurricane Ike was approaching 12 years ago and Hurricane Laura a week or so ago, do you find yourself thinking back to the 1900 storm and what might be getting ready to happen with those storms making landfall?
I think a lot about the 1900 storm, about surprising people, but not really about this. I thought a lot about Rita, in the last storm.
Okay, and lastly for Stan, that's very intriguing. I never looked at those way back storms before 1900 on the thoughts on arguments about making mitigation projects. It seemed to me when you were presenting that, let me see if I had this correct, that people really don't change that much. You hear the same sort of noise all around the U.S. coast when I talk about how vulnerable they are and how reluctant people are to believe it's going to happen and enact. Is that what you were hoping to get?
Yes, that's what I pick up. It's interesting. I don't know if you remember the old commercial. You can pay me up front or you can pay me later, and it's actually cheaper to go ahead and take care of those issues ahead of time. But usually we wait until there's a major catastrophe and then we pour extra money into it. But I think human nature, doesn't change much, unfortunately.
That's true. Tim, have you got any questions in the remaining minute or two we have?
Most of what we've heard from online has just been great presentations. Thank you. Everybody really has enjoyed this. It's been commenting online, and we appreciate that. I had a couple of questions along the way, but they were answered before it was over with, so I appreciate that. Kind of looking at today's situation and the battle for an Ike Dike, if you will, versus what was going on in 1887, 1888 is kind of a parallel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's the bells. That's signaling the end of our round.
Okay, well, thank all the speakers for the thing, and I guess we get it back to Alex real quick.
Thanks for
Right,
the
thank
invite.
Thank you, everybody. We appreciate it.
All right, I'd like to say thanks again, everybody. That was really, really great. Fantastic there. We've got Chris Lancy coming back on the 16th. He's going to be giving us another presentation there, and we're looking forward to that. You were really good today, Chris. Looking forward to this one coming up on September the 16th, 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time. And then don't forget, our sponsors for this are USAA, South Padre Island Convention and Tourist Bureau, and Plylox Hurricane Clips. Without their support, we couldn't make this program possible for you. Thank you again so much for joining us, and don't forget, join us next week.